Let's go back in time to 1932 as Converse brings you historic footage of the legendary original Celtics, with whom all great professional teams are compared.
We have now taken over your radio.
Richie Guerin is about to show you the most important step in getting past a man. It's the first one.
And Oscar will inbound it. The men in green, the Milwaukee Bucks, that's Al Cinders against Bellamy.
Has Jordan. Allen shakes free. Gets two!
Gilmore on it.
Stop!
Brother. Leave Toledo artists. You get 21.
4:28 to go in the first quarter for the Cow Palace. Here's Barry.
Jordan. Open. Chicago with the lead.
Hello and welcome back to the Over and Back Classic NBA podcast. I am co-host Jason Mann, and with me as always is Rich Kraetsch. Rich, good to be podcasting with you again.
Yes, no, definitely. It's been good. We're on a nice little roll here with the Over and Back. So
yeah, so people, of course, we've gotten some great feedback, and we would love to hear more. You can check us out on Twitter at Over and Back NBA. If you don't like Twitter, we're at thepodiumgame.com, which is in part of the Hardwood Process and Basketball Network. So if you find our post in podiumgame.com and just want to leave a little comment underneath to let us know how great we are, or how much we suck, either way, we will respect how it's intended, and we will try to do better, and
then publicly shame you,
or we will be very excited about people liking us. So, and if you do that, and also we encourage people to leave a comment and a rating on our iTunes feed. We actually share an iTunes feed with the other HB Basketball Network podcasts, some great ones there, Podium Game, of course, and Rise and Scribe. And I believe some other ones are coming to the fray, including Return to some favorites. So if you want to leave a review either of our show or of just, the whole feed, either way would be great. We will talk about any subject that you want for 2 minutes, basketball-related subject, of course. We're not sickos here, so.
I think we should do life advice as well if people want to know.
Okay, well,
you don't want my advice about it, so that's
It needs to be tasteful. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, that's fair. So, Rich, what are we talking about today?
We are talking about a very different topic. So usually we'll pick a player, talk about the seasons, that sort of stuff. This time we're decided to do a little bit different. We're doing Mr. Basketball for each city. So the criteria here is really not based on anything besides what we want to base it on. But there's a few things we're going to sort of look at. Obviously, we're going to look at win shares, titles, fame, how long you were associated with the city, the fame with other cities, all that sort of stuff. But basically, it's going to be whatever our kind of opinion is. So this is going to be a lot different than what we usually do, but still sort of based in history of us kind of talking about basketball history of each city and each town. And these are NBA cities as well, New Jersey and Seattle included as well. So
yeah, we decided to just do current NBA cities with the exception of New Jersey and Seattle, since they, of course, until recently had NBA teams. So
this isn't the Rochester. We're not going to,
right. Yeah, I think if people really like this and enjoy this, we may do something.
We have a whole list, yeah.
With some of those older teams. Maybe,
who is Mr. Sheboygan as well?
Well, yeah, maybe not exactly the same, but maybe something where we kind of talk about those old teams and some of the top players and see, because we research some data for them as well, and I think that there's some interesting things to talk about there. But let's do this show first and not get too far ahead of ourselves. So
yeah, we're going to throw it off the air pretty soon.
Yeah, well, it's very possible. Yes, so we'll try to get it as soon as we can. So we're going to kind of divide this. We're going to talk about the cities in which the choice is fairly obvious versus for Mr. Basketball, and then we're going to talk about the ones in which there might be some sharp debate. And the reason I think choosing cities as opposed to teams is important, because I do think that, once your team leaves your city, there's a decent chance you're not really going to root for them anymore. And I don't think, obviously I'm sure that Kings fans have, some affinity for Oscar Robertson. and for, Tiny Archibald and those guys, but those guys really belong to Cincinnati and Kansas City to, a certain extent.
Right.
I mean, that's where those memories were created. The people who still live in those cities, if they're old-time basketball fans, might still remember them. I mean, I know Oscar Robertson's still, a Cincinnati sports star. So, I think that I like the idea of associating it with city rather than team. And there's also some opportunities here to talk about, multiple teams in a city, and in some cases there's kind of some different impact than you might expect.
Certainly, yeah. I think that's a better way to do it as well. I think it's and it's always funny because we hear that sort of Mr. Basketball, or you hear guys that are synonymous with teams, but very rarely do they break it down by city as well. So I think we're doing something a little bit different than what most do. So I like that. That's what we aim to do here.
Absolutely. So hopefully people will enjoy what we talk about. So, so we're going to start off with, we're going to go in alphabetical order. We're going to start off with the Atlanta Hawks. The city of Atlanta. No other team has been in Atlanta besides the Hawks. So,
which is pretty. You look at a lot of these teams and these guys that move or whatever, and it always sort of seems like, especially when you get those desolate like 2000s Hawks, where or as you mentioned, the 2003, 2004, 2004, 2005 Hawks, where there's, you look in the crowd and there's like 8 people in there, and you always sort of assume that would be a city that at some point they would have moved out. But 69 to the current, they're still here.
Absolutely, yeah. So, clearly it's Dominique Wilkins. You go from a win shares perspective. And you look at a fame perspective, he's really the guy who's been the toast of the town there. He's still been involved with the organization. He was traded in 94, but he spent 12 seasons there. After retirement, has had, front office and announcing roles there. He's still, the biggest star the Hawks have. They've had some very good teams over the past few years. They actually had some decent teams in the 70s with some players who had more success than you might think. But definitely Wilkins is the
sure, yeah. I don't even think there's a number. There's some number 2s out there, the Lou Hudsons or whatever. We're going to talk about Al Horford as one as well, but I think it's pretty clear. To me, that was that's a slam dunk.
Yeah,
Al Horford,
pun
sort of intended.
He's 9th right now, and he's a guy who I think, like, with 6 strong seasons, I think even fewer than that, he's 2 or 3 strong seasons away from being number 2 in win shares, and 5 or 6 strong seasons from, at least if the Hawks have a lot of team success, certainly if they win a championship, I think that is when maybe he could get in the conversation there. I don't think he's ever going to be embraced by the city as much as Wilkins was in the 80s, but if they have a lot of team success, I think that is a very mild possibility. But that is I think he has a strong case for number 2, probably not necessarily going to reach number 1.
Sure, yeah, I think that's fair. And looking at the other numbers, there's a few guys here and there, but yeah, it's pretty clear.
Yeah, I think people are going to ask about Pete Maravich, I think, and he's 23rd in win shares for this team. He is 2 spots behind Zaza Pachulia in a similar number of minutes. So that may surprise some people, but Maravich is not a player who grades well statistically. We're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get to New Orleans. But yeah, so he is nowhere near that competition, although I guess he might have a case for being the second most famous Atlanta Hawk to, a certain extent.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say Stacey Augmon or Sharif Abdul-Rahim, but I guess no.
There you go. Yeah. The other Mutombo.
I can't believe Sharif only played 2 years there.
He played a couple more than that, but he's a hometown guy. Yeah, I think he played 4 maybe, but 3 seasons. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So,
I feel like he was there forever. I don't know. He's synonymous.
He was the Grizzlies for a long time. He bounced around, but
Kings for a while after that.
Exactly. Yeah. So the second city we're going to talk about is Brooklyn. Obviously, Brooklyn's only had a team for 2 seasons. Darren Lewis wins in win score. I think he's their most famous player. Brook Lopez has a stronger one. Has a stronger win score per 48. It's relatively close, but I would pick Williams at the moment just because Lopez has been hurt.
But it's going to be it'll be Lopez pretty quickly, I think.
Yeah, probably. Assuming health, which is not necessarily a good assumption based on the injuries he's had, but no. I don't think it'll be Darren Williams for very long. I think someone will eventually step up, whether it's a young player in a few years once they rebuild, or whether it's Lopez or something like that. Because I don't sense Darren Williams being a very good player for much longer, just because of the injuries he's had and the other issues. So So yeah, but right now I think it's clearly Darren Williams.
Yeah, no argument here.
So the city of Chicago, which of course includes the Bulls from 67 to current time, but also includes the Chicago Stags, who played from 47 to 50, and the Packers and the Zephyrs, who play from 62 and 63. They eventually became the Washington franchise. So you want to guess who's number one here, Rich?
Yeah, I'm going to go. It's probably going to be I'm trying to think here. I'm racking my brain of famous Bulls, and I'm having a little trouble here.
Yeah, I forget his name. He's the guy who with the tongue, you know?
Tom Borwinkle.
Yeah, it's very possible. That's close, you know? You're getting warmer.
Reggie Theus. Bob Boozer.
Yeah.
Clifford Ray had a good, little run there.
Sure, there you go.
Chet Walker.
Yeah, so
Brad Miller, remember the Brad Miller Bulls years?
It was good, yeah.
Nocioni, Andres Nocioni.
There you go, yeah. Norm Van Leer.
It's Nocioni. Yeah. It's fine. Move on.
Yeah,
we're good.
So, obviously it's Michael Jordan, who's more than twice as much as Scottie Pippen. So,
That's 200 win shares. And Scottie Pippen's really freaking good, and he's 99 win shares, and Michael Jordan has 204. He's double the player. And Scottie Pippen's really good.
Saying that win shares is like the best stat ever by any
Jesus,
means.
Look at the win shares.
But it's it's what Basketball Reference uses. It's good shorthand. This is just for fun, people. So
it's just unbelievable that Scottie Pippen, who's a top 50 player and a really good player, Michael Jordan's double the player he is according to win shares.
Yeah,
that's just shocking.
And Jordan doesn't have that many more games.
No, it's just
930 to 56. So it is
good player. Breaking news on the Overback podcast. Michael Jordan good at basketball.
He wasn't bad. Curious. Yeah, he was okay. So Cleveland, it's obviously clearly LeBron James, and he's 103.3. Mark Price is second with 65.4. Brad Daugherty third with 65.2. Very close there. Also a close amount of games and minutes there. But it'd be interesting because I think it's definitely LeBron, but because LeBron came back, I mean, he's the greatest player. But if he hadn't come back, then it's an interesting question.
Sure, yeah. Then you sort of get if he had always sort of been that anti, we're Cleveland, because we said we're not looking at just strictly win shares here. We're looking at guys, that would, the way the city reacts to them, and the way obviously LeBron left would have been left a sour taste. I mean, I think they sort of have forgiven him a little bit, but now it's going to be no doubter that this guy is a key to the city, and Cleveland loves him, that sort of stuff. Because you could make a case. I mean, a guy like Brad Daugherty, I think, is an interesting case, and Big Z as well. When they retired, his number was like a big deal. I mean, this would have been a very interesting conversation if he had left, and there was always sort of that sour taste of LeBron James leaving Cleveland and winning championships elsewhere, especially if this next time he spurned them again and went to somewhere else would have been if he goes to LA or something. I can't imagine. Happen.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine that happening either. But it was hard to imagine him coming back to Cleveland. So
he's got this, and will only add some distance.
Yeah, I mean, I would think Mark Price by default if it weren't LeBron, but there's there's definitely a lot of good arguments for that. So. Also, there was Cleveland had the Rebels in 47, but they did not factor. Surprisingly enough, they did not factor into this. So next we go to Dallas. The Mavericks have been around since 81. There was also the Dallas Chaparrals from 68 to 73, who eventually became the Spurs. The Chaparrals, however, do not really factor into things either. And number one with the Bullet, Dirk Nowitzki, 184.8 win shares. Number two is Rolando Blackman with 70.3. So
I'm looking at the Chaparrals' history here. Can you guess where Cincinnatus Powell was born?
Was he born in? He was either probably born in Cincinnati, Ohio, or Powell, Ohio.
No, he was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
There you go.
I don't know why his name is Cincinnatus, but there you go.
It's a good name.
It's a great name, but why is it? I assumed I was going to click on. I was like, well, that's real original. You're from Baton Rouge. Yeah. Okay.
He's the Cincinnati kid. And he's from Dallas. No.
Yeah, his nickname is Cincy.
Yeah, exactly.
Louisiana.
That's yes, but it is Dirk. I don't think there's any question that obviously led them to championship, has been their franchise player for the past 15 or so seasons. I don't think anyone is
without that title. Do you think he'd be? I mean, I think it's obvious, but do you still think? I mean, even without that title, if you it
doesn't make a big difference, but I mean, it makes a little bit of a difference. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen, but if he ever played for the team, that might have a very small, but there's just no one else who's even in his stratosphere there.
Sure, yeah, for as long as he's played as well. I mean, you can maybe make a case for Blackman before the championship or whatever, but now it's a no-doubter.
Yeah,
so.
right. I mean, the other guys, like our Derek Harper or Jason Terry, Michael Finley, but those guys are way behind, anywhere that, I mean, it's clearly Dirk without a question. So
Sean Marion already 15th in win shares. There
you go.
In Dallas history. That's a guy who piles up win shares like no other.
He does.
And rightfully
he's
so.
pretty good. He's also he wins a lot. He's had a couple of the struggles with Miami and Toronto, but otherwise he's pretty much been a winning team his entire career.
Yep.
Yeah. So next we have Houston, where they had the Mavericks from 68 to 69. No relation to the Dallas Mavericks. That's actually the franchise that became Carolina Cougars and then the Spirits of St. Louis in the ABA. And of course, since 72, the Houston Rockets. It's easy to forget that the Rockets started in San Diego just because like Houston Rockets is so natural.
It makes sense,
right?
Yeah.
Because of NASA. So, but not again. Hakeem Olajuwon, clearly the dominant guy there.
Oh yeah. I don't think there's really.
He has 160 win shares in 1,011, 77 games. One that's interesting and is that Moses Malone has 70 in 464 games. So if you extrapolated, he would, if he had played more of his career in Houston and they'd won a title during the years that he were there, then I think that conversation might change a little bit. I mean that would definitely be interesting. I mean, it's just I think Moses Malone is maybe a guy who most historically suffers from being on a lot of different teams.
Yeah, right.
Maybe
he's not synonymous with any
he's
team,
not synonymous with one team necessarily, and which kind of maybe undermines his greatness. I mean, there are other guys who that Chamberlain and LeBron to a certain extent, but they kind of have one dominant team or one dominant city, and Moses doesn't quite have that.
Sure.
So, so you want to talk about the next city?
Yeah, let's go here. So we have Indianapolis here, and they had the Jets in 1949. They had the Olympians in 1950 through 1953, and then obviously the Pacers since 1968. So this one's Reggie Miller. I mean, that goes without saying. You have a few guys, current guys as well, like a Paul George or even a Paul Millsap or not Paul Millsap, fucking Roy Hibbert. Yeah. I don't know why Paul Millsap and Paul.
Lots of Pauls.
Yeah, Yeah. So, but I think they would have to really cement like an amazing career to even touch Reggie Miller, and I don't think it's even close here. I don't think there's even another person that I would even consider.
I would have considered George a more of a possibility, although with a very long road. If with the broken leg is going to set him back, definitely he's not going to play next year. And there's, I think, a good chance. It was talked about on the Make or Miss podcast recently, where George. There's no guarantee that he's going to be the same player, at least for a while when he comes back. Mm-hmm. I mean, it may take another year just for him to kind of, get back into, kind of where he was, if he's even capable of doing that. So, but if he's able to, I think he might have an outside chance if they're able to kind of rebuild around him and mm-hmm. he, goes on the track that he is on. But yeah, I mean,
it's all about success as well. When you look at a Reggie Miller, I mean, he's a guy that brought and he really was. And when you watch those sort of, the Spike Lee, 30 for 31 or whatever, Reggie Miller was the guy they rallied behind, and he rallied behind them, and it was like, I'm this is my city, and we're Naptown, and that's what I mean. There was a lot of stuff where he really just like, and then the success. I mean, he put that city on the map in terms of basketball.
Sure,
so yeah,
sure.
It would be it would take Paul George being the centerpiece of a title team, really, I think, to even get close to that. So
agreed, and I think Miller has benefited because obviously they had deep postseason and they had deep postseason runs against and memorable playoff series against the Bulls and the
big cities,
right?
Too,
and those are glorified to an even added extent because of that. So
and the era as well.
Right, exactly. So So Miami is next. Of course, the Heat since '89. They also had the Floridians from '69 to '72 in the ABA, but they're not really a factor. It's clearly Dwayne Wade, who has 105.4 win shares in 719 games. Second is LeBron James with 65.3 in 294 games. So obviously a much better win shares for 48, but Wade carried them to the title team in 06 as well. He's going to be there for probably most, if not all, of his career. LeBron obviously went back to Cleveland. If LeBron had stayed, I think LeBron would have taken that mantle eventually. But I think it's Wade now. I guess if there is some sort of falling out with him in the organization, and I guess that's pretty much the case with anyone, it's possible. But I think that I don't see anyone taking that away from him anytime soon.
No, and Alonzo Mourning's an interesting case because he still kind of works for the team and that sort of stuff. But yeah, I think it's pretty clearly Wade.
Yeah, exactly. He's third. He's right behind LeBron there. But yeah, it's definitely Wade. I mean, Mourning's definitely an important guy because of of that role as well, and his contributions and his inspiring story and all of that. But yeah, so.
It's Wade.
Next is New Orleans. They have the Buccaneers of the ABA from 68 to 70. They have the Jazz from 75 to 79. And then, of course, they have the Hornets and now Pelicans from 03 to current time. So Chris Paul is definitely your winner, 76.4 win shares. David West has about half that. Actually, well, more than half that. But I think it's clearly Paul. And it's kind of surprising because actually the guy who'd be third is Jimmy Jones of the Buccaneers. and you would think Maravich, of course, but Maravich isn't even number one on the Jazz. It's Rich Kelly who is ahead of Maravich. Statistically, Maravich does not have a strong career, and he didn't win either. So I think Maravich is going to be an interesting guy to examine.
And he bounced around too. Similar to the Moses Malone thing, it's hard.
Well,
he's synonymous with a few teams. Well, but
Maravich really had the Jazz and the Hawks. I mean, he had his final season with Boston, but I do think that there is something to that. But I do think Maravich is a kind of interesting guy to examine. I mean, there've been a couple of books on him. I know we've had a couple of requests to do a podcast on him, and I don't know if there's a lot more to say than those books haven't said, but it is weird. He's definitely a guy who I think, if you're taking statistically, he's definitely a guy whose reputation way exceeds what the numbers show his production have. Which the numbers may not show everything, and he's certainly an exciting player to watch. So there's that, but yeah, as far as production goes, he is surprisingly low on both the New Orleans and the Atlanta lists, I would say.
Yeah, and Anthony Davis is a guy that sticks out to me right away, who's already fifth in terms of the Hornets win shares, and a guy that I think the Pelicans win shares, right? The Hornets / Pelicans, obviously win shares there. But no, he's a guy that I definitely see him sort of taking the reins eventually, because I still think there's a little uneasiness about Chris Paul. I mean, he might in the end be received pretty well, but I think this is Anthony Davis's to take. So if he just continues on his career trajectory, no doubt in my mind that he will be that Mr. New Orleans basketball. But it's going to be a while. I mean, he could leave after a few years, and then we'll see that.
That's possible, but I have a feeling it will be Anthony Davis. I definitely agree with that. So next, Oklahoma City, and surprise, surprise, it's Kevin Durant.
Yeah, that's no question, and that's going to be forever.
Yeah, I mean, unless he leaves and Russell Westbrook stays and is leads them to some deep playoff runs, that's the only way I could see it. But production wise, there's no way Westbrook would match Durant. Yeah, so. Portland's a bit of an interesting one. I mean, I think it's clearly Clyde Drexler, who led them to the finals, 108 win shares in 867 games. There are some other players who do pretty well in win shares per 48 there. There's Terry Porter, Rasheed Wallace, LaMarcus Aldridge, who's coming up and could be a guy who contends for this in a few years if he kind of continues his career track. But I do think that it's still Drexler. I mean, I think Porter was always kind of, the sidekick, for lack of a better term, for Drexler. Maybe he's a little bit underrated as a player, actually. But and they kind of had a deep, they had a lot of very good players on those teams as well. I mean, they were a very deep team. So, but Drexler, I think, clearly was the number one star there.
Sure, yeah, and there's it's an interesting one to Portland, because I look at a guy like to me, when I think of Portland basketball, for whatever reason, my mind immediately goes to Bill Walton,
Yes.
and you mentioned he's 22nd or whatever, but there's just something so synonymous with that, and you think about, he's a guy who came in there with a lot of hype, won a title, that sort of stuff. So to me, when I think Portland basketball, I immediately go to Bill Walton, and I don't know if that's just my personal bias, even though Clyde Drexler clearly probably has a better case in terms of stats or whatever, but I think of Walton for fame and that sort of stuff, because he's just, to me, I imagine him in that that 70s Blazers uniform with his big mutton chops and his ridiculous hair, and that's immediately what comes to mind for me.
Yeah, and Walton, I think, would be it if he had played longer in Portland and had been healthier. And I think a part of that is just because there was a famous book written about the Blazers. That's the seminal book about NBA basketball that I think enhances his reputation. Obviously, The championship is there. And Drexler, one knock on him that may or may not be important is that he also is very associated with the Houston franchise. He won that title there. He played college there, and he's an announcer there. So Portland isn't even necessarily like his main, absolutely his number one city. But I think I think because of his accomplishments there, I think I still have to give it to him right now. But I do think LaMarcus is a guy who could end up being particularly if they have some good playoff success.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's still an open debate. I think this isn't one that's going to be closed forever. Chicago is likely going to be. There's an opportunity there for someone to sort of take the reins.
Yeah. So we have Salt Lake City, which the Utah Jazz since 1980 when they moved from New Orleans. There was also the Utah Stars of the ABA, although even though they had 5 seasons there, they were not really much of a factor. But they did have some good players. But this is obviously dominated by Malone and Stockton. Malone with 230 win shares, Stockton with 207. Just two of the best players at their positions of all times. Just everything incredible. Everything is dominated there. It's not impossible, but it is so highly unlikely that anyone is ever going to exceed those two players.
Yeah, and that's one that I can't really pick between either of them, because it wouldn't be fair, right? To name one of them. It's got to be Stockton and Malone.
If I'm pressed, I would pick Malone.
Sure.
I guess Malone, the only knock there is that he left for a year and Stockton played there his whole career, but that's not really a big deal, I don't think. They're both associated.
If you go to my head, if you said choose one, I would probably choose Malone, but that's tough, because you mentioned the thing of him sort of going elsewhere. But yeah, this is one that I think it has to be these two, and it's these two forever. I don't think anybody could. Maybe somebody if Gordon Hayward leads them to multiple championships, maybe.
We'll talk
about that. I'm not holding my breath for that one. So
there's definitely no breath holding here. So next we have Seattle, which had the Supersonics from 68 to 08.
You're gonna make a lot of people wink.
Sorry, Sonics fans.
Yeah.
I apologize.
Well, now we just got unsubscribed.
That was insensitive. I didn't mean to be a jerk about it. A storied history, win shares is by a strong lead is Gary Payton with 123.8. There's also Jack Sikma in there with 79. Win shares per 48 is still won by Payton, but it's a little bit closer if you consider that measure. Sikma also led them to a championship. Payton's a Hall of Famer. He did play other places other than Seattle. I think Sikma actually did too, but it was mostly I guess they were both mostly after their prime. So
Sikma went to Milwaukee.
That's right. Yeah, he played there for 5 years. Actually had a pretty good run in Milwaukee as well. That's right. So and Payton, of course, played for a lot of teams, won a title in Miami, although he was a bit player by then. Made an important shot, I believe, for in the finals, if I recall correctly.
Yep.
But I
three, wasn't it? It was like a corner three or something.
Yeah,
if I remember, yeah.
I think it's Payton. They have some memorable other players as well, but Sean Kemp rates highly, but obviously he left and just and things went downhill for him. So yes, but yeah, obviously it's Payton. So last but not least in the low debate category is the San Antonio Spurs, San Antonio City, this only team there being the Spurs in 74. And win shares, it's very close between Tim Duncan and David Robinson, 191.6 to 178. Duncan leads there. But Although, Robinson was part of 2 of their championships and an important part of the first one. I mean, important part of the second one, but he was a role player by then. I mean, it's clearly Duncan, I have to say. Even though the win share for 48 is better for Robinson, I think it just has to be Duncan,
Yeah, and I think Robinson has a case that you can make that, he was another guy that sort of put them on the map in a lot of ways and was big. But yeah, I think at this point, especially after this past year, it's Tim Duncan. I mean, that guy is otherworldly. Yeah. In terms of San Antonio, you just can't mess with the combination of staying in that city, taking pay cuts to remain there, winning the titles. That's what I mean. The resume is pretty much there.
The greatness and longevity. I mean, Robinson was great for a while, for a good length of time as well. But his teams weren't nearly as successful, obviously.
Sure.
I mean, he obviously doesn't compare either. But George Gervin, obviously was the guy, the franchise in the 70s and 80s, and really helped, establish them. I mean, on a lot of franchises, he would be a number 1, but he's a distant number 3 here, which says a lot about the franchise. So,
Artis Gilmore showing up on a lot of lists.
Yeah,
so
Artis Gilmore was really good. Yeah,
he was on the Chicago list. I see him on the San Antonio list right now. I mean,
late in his career, yeah. So
yeah, I can't believe, I'm seeing him right there. He's a guy that keeps coming up.
Number 1 in the Kentucky Colonels list as well. So
oh, absolutely, yeah.
So So that's it for our initial list of cities in which we both basically are going to agree. And then we're going to take a little break, and then we'll come back and we'll have some roaring debate. There's going to be yelling and screaming and anger. It's going to be like,
and the show will cease to exist after this show because we'll be so angry about who you picked as Charlotte's
I will be the
player.
Stephen A. Smith to your Skip Bayless.
Perfect.
All right.
All right, and we're back, and now the feverish debate portion of this podcast, we're going to talk about cities in which the debate is needed. So these are cities, NBA cities that we think there's not a shoe. I mean, we mentioned a few guys in different cities. Obviously, like a Chicago had to be a Michael Jordan, but now we're going to get into a lot of teams that I don't know if there is one that sticks out. So now this is where, as we said, the podcast will cease to exist after this because we'll be so angry about each other of who, the best Detroit Falcon or Detroit Piston ever is. So we'll start off first. Obviously, we're going to do this alphabetical like we did the first portion. We'll start out with Boston. And obviously, there has only been one team in Boston, the Boston Celtics, since 1947. Now, this one is interesting because this, I feel like a lot of people would have this sort of debate, and this is a debate that's probably been done, previously is, who's the best Celtic of all time? Who's that Mr. Celtics or whatever? You have obviously Bill Russell, who leads in win shares. Larry Bird is second in win shares. Paul Pierce third, and then John Havlicek fourth. I think those are kind of the only guys I would use. Most likely, a Russell, Bird, and Pierce are probably the only guys I would really debate with. For you, who is it for you? I mean, this one's really hard.
Yeah, I mean, honestly,
and you're not wrong in any one. I mean, you're really not, especially if you choose Russell or Bird. There's no way to really be wrong in this one.
Yeah, realistically, it's Russell or Bird. I don't think Pierce and Havlicek are obviously great, but I think it's Russell or Bird. And for me, it's Russell. I mean, 11 championships, the guy who redefined defense in the league. His importance also off the court in terms of a social awareness and civil rights, and
breaking the ground.
And just revolutionizing the game. I mean, Bird is so incredible as well and such a great player, and maybe probably was embraced by the city more than Russell was. But I do think that, even though Russell coached Seattle and Kansas City, I mean, he's pretty much only a Celtic. Bird has those Indiana ties too. I mean, that doesn't necessarily, matter a strong suit because Larry Bird is primarily still a Celtic, but I do think that, is a nudge in Russell's favor. But, 11 championships, that's, I mean.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to mess with that.
And being the best player on all all but maybe one or two of those teams. So.
Sure, yeah, I would probably. I mean, we're unfortunately we led this off by saying we were going to debate and yell and scream, but I'm pretty much with Russell on that as well. So I think it's hard to argue with the titles and on the floor and as a coach as well, player coach and that sort of stuff. Yeah, to me, he's definitely the one. And if you made an argument for Bird, I would certainly not argue with you. But everybody else, I think, is definitely a step down. So we'll now move on to Charlotte, and they obviously have had a few different franchises, and now they're back to the Hornets. But from '89 to 2002, they had the Charlotte Hornets, and then they had obviously the Bobcats until this year, where now they're coming back to the Hornets. So that was 2005 until the current still the same franchise, but now the Hornets, and it's confusing.
Yeah.
But this one is a very interesting one because nobody really stands out. I mean, there's really, to me, I cannot. It's so hard to think of any Bobcat as a Mr. Charlotte basketball because you're just so synonymous with the Hornets of the early 90s and just, they took the city by storm and they were, the NBA's best crowd and kids grew up and they were teal and everybody had a starter jacket with Hornets on it. So to me, I look at like a guy like Muggsy Bogues and I think he's my number one, which is pretty interesting, but there's not really anybody that stands out. It's hard. It's a really tough one.
Yeah, I mean, I think the candidates are Gerald Wallace, who had 45.9 win shares in 454 games. Definitely is the number one Bobcat without any question. And then Bogues, as you mentioned, who it had 44.8 win shares, but in 632 games. So a lot more games than either Wallace or Larry Johnson, who had 41.1 and 377 games had. So, this is a tough one. I think I might go with Johnson. I think
it's hard to be wrong on this one.
I think he was it's the best player of the three, although he did play, other places as well. Had a run in New York where it took him to the finals. I think Bogues is more associated with the Hornets, especially like from the beginning through there. So, and obviously just because of his size, is a well-known, colorful player.
Sure.
Wallace, I think the Bobcats never captured the imagination of Charlotte or the NBA. So, I think I would go with Johnson, but I could see a case being made for any of the three players.
Sure, and then this next wave of Bobcats, I mean, it's wide open for them. I mean, one of them just has to stay there for about 10 years and be good, and it's all theirs. So we'll move on now to Denver, who in 1950 were the Nuggets, and then obviously came back and were in 1968 the Rockets, and then went back to the Nuggets until the current incarnation. This one is interesting. To me, there's one clear one that I sort of think, but it's a guy that you wouldn't normally think, and that's Dan Issel, who I think he does lead in win shares for the franchise. And then you have Alex English. Carmelo is fifth at 53.5. A few other guys come in there. To me, I would probably put Issel, but this is another one where you can't really be wrong. I mean, and Alex English is fun. David Thompson is one that comes to mind too of a guy of me who watched a ton of dunk contests when I was growing up. He's the guy that's always synonymous with me. But yeah, I would probably put Issel in there, obviously, because he came back and coached and that sort of stuff. English is a good one. I don't think Carmelo at this point. I think he's sort of cemented himself in a lot of ways with the Knicks.
Yeah.
So I would probably not put him.
Probably soured things the way he left as well.
Sure.
I mean, I think Thompson's an interesting one. Just the kind of the lack of longevity for him of being a great player, but he did, I mean, that was toward the end of his career, and he produced pretty well, for them. Obviously that's strong. I think I would agree that it would be Issel. I don't know, if he's the first guy I think of, because it might be English, just if I thought about, okay, who's the Denver Nugget, other than Anthony, but obviously we've explained the reasons why he wouldn't necessarily be it.
I think Dikembe a lot as well.
That's true. But he didn't last there that long.
No, not at all.
But yeah, I mean, he's that signature moment, of course, of him, against Seattle and blocking that shot. I think that's probably why that is. He's that great highlight for the Nuggets. I mean, they don't have titles in their history. I mean, the Nuggets have had a lot of good teams, but few great ones. So it's hard for anyone to kind of distinguish themselves, through stuff like that. But yeah, I would say I think Issel would be my choice as well.
Definitely. We'll move on to Detroit. In 1947, they had the Detroit Falcons, but then obviously from 1958 until the current, they had the Detroit Pistons. This one is interesting. There's a lot of guys that, again, you can make an argument for. Number one in win shares is Bill Laimbeer.
Not a surprise.
No, that's not a surprise at all. I mean, that's a lot of longevity there as well. You have guys, you have Bob Lanier, Joe Dumars, Isiah Thomas, even Chauncey Billups has an argument here.
Well, I think it's a little bit of a surprise because he played essentially the same amount of time as Isiah Thomas, and he's
I would
far
assume
ahead of Isiah Thomas. That's kind of more what I mean by it being a surprise.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, because no, I thought there was a little bit less overlap, but there's an exact overlap. I had no idea. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, Thomas actually played like 40
less games too. Yeah, less games for Laimbeer.
Wow. And 5,000 more minutes. And yeah, I mean that's a real. I mean, I've always, Isaiah's always kind of been not quite as much as Maravich, but Thomas has always been kind of a guy whose statistics don't necessarily match up with his reputation as a great player. The numbers just aren't quite there for him. This isn't the podcast where we have the argument whether they actually are accurate or not, but at least in his case, he won championships and was great. But I think Laimbeer accomplished the same team success that Thomas did, and I do think like Laimbeer is a guy who is not necessarily appreciated for being quite as good as he was. I mean, he was a 4-time All-Star and he was a productive scorer. I mean, he really did have. You look at his numbers and they're you kind of think of him as just kind of like rough enforcer, and fine, he rebounded, but it wasn't he didn't necessarily there, but he was a pretty good scorer too. I mean, double digit. He averaged 16, 17 for a few seasons. I mean, he was very good as well. And obviously, as a defender. So, that's an interesting comparison as well. And of course, a guy like Bob Lanier, from before the glory days of the Celtics, as far as win share per 48, I think he is the winner there. But, and while, I think maybe the problem that he has is he's stuck in an era where no one was paying attention to the Pistons and not a lot of people were paying attention to the NBA, and there wasn't much team success.
Sure, yeah, and this is an interesting one because when I sort of do it, and my initial thought would be an Isiah Thomas, but you really start to look at the life and career of Bill Laimbeer, and obviously coming back to coach the Detroit Shock and stuff like that of the WNBA. Yeah, Laimbeer makes a really good case, and I guess you sort of underrate how good of a player he was. I mean, to me, when I think of Detroit, I think of Isiah, but
I do think that Billups is kind of an interesting one of those late those 2000 Celtics team because he's another guy who per win score per 48 is really, really good. I mean, you compare him to Thomas, he has almost as many win shares in half the minutes. And it's kind of an interesting. I mean, I don't know exactly what it says, but I think it's interesting. Look,
sure.
So I don't know who's the guy that you would pick out of these. I mean, there's a lot of interesting candidates here. We didn't even mention Dumars, who's a guy who's,
sure.
I mean, had the longer career, so the win shares for 48 isn't as good, but of course was the GM for a long time, had some success, and then had big failure. But this is a really tough one. Maybe the toughest one that there is.
Yeah, this is hard because there's a lot of really good guys, and I think I would initially just go with Isiah because that's where my mind goes. But the more I'm thinking about it, the more I'm not. And then you just mentioned that Dumars was the GM, and I'm like, oh yeah, he was the GM for a long time. Like, I don't know. I mean, going to my head, I would probably do Isiah, but man, you could argue me off of that in 2 seconds.
Yeah,
with Dumars, Laimbeer. I mean, I would even hear a Billups. I would honestly even hear a Billups.
Yeah,
that's
I think I might go with Laimbeer. Honestly, I mean, I think the kind of the numbers make that case for me a little bit, but any of those I think are legitimate arguments. Absolutely.
Sure. We'll move on to the Los Angeles franchise. Obviously, we have the Lakers. Since 1961, you have the Los Angeles Stars as well from 69 to 70, and then the Clippers. So we're adding the Clippers into here, 85 to 2014, the Los Angeles Clippers. So a few names here that are very interesting. Obviously, you have a Kobe Bryant, Jerry West, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Magic Johnson. I mean, this is a tough one. You even have a guy like Shaq that you could make an argument for. He's quite a bit lower in the win shares and does pretty well in win shares per 48, but the overall win share is a little bit low. And then like an Elgin Baylor as well, but he's also pretty low. To me, I think it's Bryant, West, Kareem, or Magic. And that's a tough man. Like Detroit, this is hard. I don't know. I would probably do Magic initially, just based off his fame and his kind of being synonymous with that franchise. But I mean, like on the court wise, you can definitely do Kobe. I don't think you're wrong doing that.
I think it's down to Magic or Kobe. Although I hate to say that about West because he's so fantastic. Kareem too. I mean, and especially impressive since Kareem did a lot of that toward the end of his career in his late 30s and into 40. I think if you also consider like Magic's association with the Lakers for the rest of his time after his playing career, and I assume Kobe will be the same, but I mean Magic just has that longevity ahead of him.
And that smile. I mean, come on.
Yeah, I think I will pick Magic, but anyone who picked Kobe or even West or Kareem, you made that case. I think there, and you're right. Shaq and Baylor, there's some interesting talk there, but. The one thing I think is interesting conversation is like, okay, where is the first Clipper you would put? Like,
yeah, who's Mr. Clipper? Yeah.
Right. I mean, where does Mr. Clipper rank among Mr. Los Angeles? You know,
Sure, right.
Elton Brand is the guy who I would definitely say would be Mr. Clipper, although Blake's probably going to surpass him in a couple years. Chris Paul,
I think so.
But Blake's so much younger that I feel like he'll stay in the Clippers, for a longer period of time. But yeah, I mean, he'd be 8th in win shares. Brand would be, but I would say around 17th if titles and fame are considered. Probably like right, maybe before Derek Fisher, right after Derek Fisher, before Happy Hairston and Vlade Divac. That sounds about right to me. I don't know. I mean, that's sort of a tough one to call because Elton Brand was actually really good, but he just the Clippers did have a couple of good teams with him, but they just have been such an afterthought until recently that it's hard to it's hard to rank them just based on the numbers because of just the disparity in fame and success of those two franchises.
Certainly, yeah. It would be hard. I mean, I think when you think of it overall of like, would a Clipper ever be able to surpass any of these guys? And I would be hard pressed to say any. I mean, even if Blake Griffin has just a tremendous career, I mean, you're talking Kobe, West, Kareem, and Magic. Like,
I mean,
and then the Shaq and Elgin. I mean, it would take a lot of work for. That's a lot of titles there. You got to work.
Of course, but it's like unimaginable.
He needs to start winning next year and then be dominant for the next 10.
It would take a lot of titles and a lot of individual success. He's been very good, but he would need to be better. I mean, he would need to be the second or third best player in the league starting next season for a while, and eventually be the best player in the league for that to be anywhere near a conversation.
All right, so we have Memphis next, correct?
Yes. They of course were the Grizzlies since 2002, moving from Vancouver. They also had the Memphis Pros, the Memphis Tams, and the Memphis Sounds from 71 to 75 in the ABA, but they're not really a big factor here. And you're basically down to the Gasol brothers. Pau still leads in win shares, 53 to 48. Similar number of games. Pau's a few more games, so Mark's going to pass him in that next year, presumably. I guess maybe the way that Pau left, I would go with Mark. They've had more team success under Mark, although it's obviously been with Conley and Randolph as well, who are also, I think, in this conversation, although not quite there. So I think I would say Mark.
Yeah, I would probably go with Mark as well, but the more I sort of look at it and the more I thought of it, and this is one that I sort of bolded and kind of wanted to look at a little bit more, Zach Randolph is one that's very interesting to me because he's a guy who came in here as sort of a troubled man and, that sort of stuff, and people, they're not sure about his motivation and all that sort of stuff, and he's come here, he's been a model citizen. I mean, the success has followed him as well. I mean, they've been a super successful team. He's a guy that I think is synonymous with a lot of those long, playoff runs and that sort of stuff, and he's a guy that when you look at their advertising, he's front and center. It's like, this is a guy that's so to me, I mean, I think when it's all said and done, because I think Zach's only got a few more, years left in the tank, and Mark's obviously got a lot more. I think it's going to be Mark, but I think if right now, I would probably go with Zach Randolph, just because I think the combination of fame, being that sort of veteran, being that to me, he's just so synonymous with the success that they've had in the playoffs in those recent years and those big playoff runs. So I would put him there, but yeah, he's an interesting case.
Yeah,
for sure.
I see that argument. I think I would still go with Mark, but I definitely see where you're coming from there, and I think that's a good point. So next we have Milwaukee, which, of course, the Bucks since 1969. Also the Hawks from 52 to 55, although they're, again, not really much of a factor here. So the leader in 6 seasons was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar with 114.7 in 467 games. And then number 2, Sidney Moncrief with 88.5 in 695. Also won the title and had, I believe, 4 60-win teams in six seasons with Kareem. Moncrief led some really good Bucks teams, underrated Bucks teams that had some good. They swept the Celtics in '83, I believe, but never made a real deep run in the playoffs. So that's an interesting case because, of course, Kareem left, and he's better known as a Laker. Moncrief is, lesser known player, but a very good one. He spent most, if not all, his career with the Bucks. So I don't know. Do you have strong thoughts about this?
Yeah, this one's a little tough because on the court, I mean, you pretty much have to pick Kareem based off that, but it's so hard because I don't know if he is as synonymous with that. I mean, I go to a number of Bucks games per year because I just love going to Milwaukee and checking them out or whatever, but you don't really get. I don't get the idea that he's this guy that, I mean, obviously they retired his number and there's some videos here and there of him, but he's just not a guy that I think that they really have embraced as much as being their sort of their leader. They're Mr. Basketball. I mean, I don't get that feeling when I walk into the arena, and I don't know if I get a feeling for anybody in there. I mean, Moncrief is a tough one as well. Ray Allen is a guy that you see a lot all over the place in Milwaukee, but because he's had so much success elsewhere, it's hard to do that. A guy like Michael Redd is interesting. You see him a ton of places there because he was a guy who the bulk of his good years were there. But I mean, I'd be really hard pressed to say Michael Redd. This one's tough because there's a lot of good guys, but I'm not sure who you would put there. I mean, I think I would probably go with Kareem, but I just don't know if they've really embraced him as that either. Or I don't know if the city of Milwaukee is not, if they think of Kareem as their favorite Buck of all time, unless, you're 60 years old and maybe then, but like this new generation, I mean, there's no way that they, well, they have fond memories of Kareem.
We all know that it's going to be Giannis. He's eventually going to be the greatest Buck ever. Yeah. So we're not going to have to worry about this in a few years.
Yeah, so Jabari and Giannis, you guys take that over because or Sonny Ilisovic if he continues his
exactly.
meteoric mediocrity, then maybe he can.
Right, there you go. So the next one is maybe my favorite one because it's Minneapolis, who of course had the Lakers from 49 to 60, had the Wolves since 1990, also a couple of ABA teams, the Muskies and the Pipers for one season each, but again, those not really the factor. But you have Kevin Garnett with 138.4 win shares in 927 games, and then George Mikan with 108 in 439 games. And Mikan, of course, they won 4 titles in 5 years. Of course, it's a completely different game. I don't know how Mikan is felt about in Minneapolis today, if the Timberwolves have at all embraced that history. I mean, it's obviously the Lakers history, so it's a weird one, but at the same time, it all happened in Minneapolis. So I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, to me, I'd go with Garnett regardless here. Mike, and that could just be my bias of me growing up with because Mike, and obviously he set a standard there and was a very important player in that time. So I'm sure there's 6 or 7 year olds, I don't know if they're listening to this podcast, that are telling me I'm a complete idiot or something. In some cases a lot older than that are, to me, I don't have a connection to Mikan as much. I mean, I've seen just clips here and there, and I know about it, the history and all that sort of stuff. But to me, I put Garnett, but that's my personal bias.
Yeah, I would pick Mikan. I mean, just because he put the NBA on the map. I think the Winters 48 helps a little bit. The 5 titles, the fact that Garnett's best team success has come in a different city, I think that all of that, I think makes me pick Mikan. But I see the arguments for Garnett. I mean, Garnett's a transformative player. The win shares comparison may not be very good because of just how different the leagues were during the time. I mean, obviously Mikan was pre-shot clock basically, so. It's really a completely different game, but yeah, I just think of because of what Mikan meant to the early stages of the game and how he was able to set up basically was the NBA's first star and kept it alive, until it could until the Russell era essentially. I think that would be why I would pick him.
One sec, my girlfriend's typing on my computer while I'm trying to do this. Moving on to New Jersey, we got the New Jersey Americans from 1968, and then obviously the New Jersey Nets from 78 to 2012.
And the Americans and Nets are the same franchise. The Americans were in New Jersey for a while, then became New York Americans, then changed the name to the Nets, and then once they joined the NBA, they went back to New Jersey. So
sure, and then the New Jersey Nets, obviously, we're encompassing New Jersey as the city or whatever, because they were in freaking
it's obviously New Jersey is not a city, but they were in Teaneck for that year in 68. Then they were in Piscataway from 77 to 81, East Rutherford from 81 to 2010, and the Prudential Center from 10 until they moved to Brooklyn. So, three, or I guess 4 different cities, but all of them basically representing the same area, more or less. I believe that's true. My Northeast geography is not the best, so if I'm wrong about that, I apologize, but this is kind of the best we could do given just the weirdness of the New Jersey situation. So, yeah,
for me, I'm going Jason Kidd here because I think, and that could again be personal bias of sort of when I grew up. But with the success that New Jersey Nets had during his time there, and it was pretty much he came there and then they had their success. I mean, unless I don't know how much of it you're going to attribute to Richard Jefferson and Kerry Kittles, but to me, it was Jason Kidd that went there and really put them on the map in a lot of ways.
I think Jefferson helped, and Kenny Martin as well. I mean, I think they did have some good players there, but yes, I would agree. I think it's Kidd too. I mean, I think Buck Williams is a case. He actually has the most win shares in state history, I guess. 62.8 in 635 games versus 56.6 for Kidd in 506 games. Kidd, I think's hurt a little bit because he had a lot of success in other places. Williams did have success in Portland, but he's more of a role player. I mean, Kidd was definitely more of a star. It's interesting, of course, because of what happened in this offseason with Kidd leaving the Nets franchise as a coach, but he left the Brooklyn city, not New Jersey, and I don't know how many New Jersey Nets
New Jersey
fans
are harboring ill will over that.
Nets fans. I mean, I assume there's still some overlap, and maybe quite a bit. I mean, Brooklyn, miles wise, as the crow flies wise, is not actually that far from where they played in Newark, but it is quite a distance. I understand. People who live in New Jersey just realistically aren't going to go to Brooklyn very often. So I don't know if that really has any effect or not, but I don't sense Buck Williams as being really a guy who's embraced necessarily by, New Jersey fans. And I guess this is a tough one because that move is so fresh and it is relatively geographically close. It's not the same as Oklahoma City to Seattle. It doesn't have that kind of vibe. There's still, at least it's close enough where there's still maybe some, kind of link there,
Absolutely. So now we'll move on to New York, where it gets a little bit more interesting here. You got the Nets, 1969 to 1977, New York Nets, and then obviously the Knicks from 47 to 14.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, I mean, the one guy you think of first maybe is Patrick Ewing, who has 123 win shares per in 1,039 games, but then somebody like Walt Frazier, who had 108 in 759. So excuse me. So Ewing obviously has more, but Frazier definitely has it in the win shares for 48. I think the way those Knicks teams are lionized in the 70s, the fact that Frazier's been with the franchise for, as a broadcaster forever, even though, that was more of a unified team, and Ewing was definitely clearly the best player on his team pretty much his entire career, where Frazier, there were 2 or 3 other Knicks you could argue might be the best Knick of his era. I think I might go with Frazier, but it's definitely an interesting discussion.
Yeah, I initially, when I think of it, I do Ewing right away. But yeah, Frazier's a very interesting one because he's still synonymous with that franchise. I mean, you still, I watch Knicks games on on League Pass, and he's there and he's yucking it up, and they every time they show a clip of him with his outrageous fashion and all that sort of stuff. So to me, yeah, it's very interesting with him. But yeah, I would go Ewing. I would absolutely go Ewing, I think.
One note, and he's definitely not number one, but Julius Erving has had 51.8 win shares in 252 games, which would be 8th in New York history during his time with the Nets, which, he's obviously more he's obviously more synonymous with Philly, but I do think that's an interesting just an interesting footnote.
Quick. All right, we'll move on to Oakland here. You have the Oakland Oaks. Obviously, if you listen to our Rick Barry podcast, you know much about that. It's from 1968 to 1969. And then the Warriors from 72 to 2014. Very interesting one. I think this one, there's guys now. I think there's a guy that's definitely going to take the reins there when it's all said and done. I think that's Steph Curry. But you have obviously Chris Mullen, Rick Barry, current ones. There's a few other guys in there, but I think this is Steph Curry's to win. A few more years of him, and I think he is going to be synonymous with it. But Chris Mullen's a guy who's sort of hung around the franchise post-playing career, so that definitely helps in my mind. But
yeah, I think because Barry led them to a championship, I think I might there might be some benefit there, and of course this is from 72 for him to 78, so it doesn't count his San Francisco time,
Sure.
It's only his Oakland time. So that maybe changes it a little bit, but I would pick Barry, but you can make the case for Mullen. I don't think Curry necessarily has it in the bag, but it's certainly a possibility. I mean, with there's the injury history, although he's been pretty healthy more recently. So, I could see that happening, but they also would need quite a bit of team success, and out west that's not guaranteed. Deep playoff runs are not guaranteed despite the talent they have on that team.
Absolutely. You have Orlando. Obviously, they've only had the Magic since 1990. You have Dwight Howard, Nick Anderson, Shaquille O'Neal, Tracy McGrady as possible options here. This one's tricky because everybody just kind of leaves Orlando. Yes. So it's like, what jilted lover, which one would they pick? You have Howard, who obviously leads in win shares, but Shaq is a guy that really he's sort of synonymous from a merchandising standpoint and that logo, and you just sort of always sort of you sort of just assume Shaquille O'Neal, but you have guys like Nick Anderson who are. I mean, this one's tough because there's just which of the guys that left them in a heap would be the best.
And Penny Hardaway, who's fifth in there. I guess Jameer Nelson to a certain extent, although he's obviously just been a role player.
He's an interesting one. No, he's an interesting one because I think he's a guy that they've sort of embraced because he's the one that hasn't gotten away because he's not that good.
He finally did. He finally went to. Yeah. But he had a long run there, obviously. So I think because of the length and the advantage of win shares, I think I would pick Dwight, even though I fully understand that probably most Orlando fans might not agree with me, but without a good alternative, I guess that's kind of the thing. The thing that I found interesting is that Shaq and McGrady played in 295 games. Shaq had 48.3 win shares and McGrady had 48.2.
Which is crazy that Shaq didn't have higher. You know what I mean?
Well, they only play. He wasn't quite as dominant until he got a bit older.
Higher than McGrady. I think McGrady was a great player.
McGrady was. He had a couple of awesome years. 03, 02, 03, and 04. He was just an outstanding player. So,
and I guess if you really look at the peak of Shaq was those LA years where he was just unstoppable.
Right. Shaq was obviously great, but yeah. So
all right.
Next,
go ahead. Yeah.
Next week, there's Philadelphia, and there's a lot of interesting choices here. But the clear one is Will Chamberlain. The interesting thing is there's actually two significant franchises. There's the Warriors from 47 to 62, and then the 76ers from 64 to 14. And Chamberlain had a total of 103 win shares in 508 games, and no one else even comes close to that. They have a lot of players that were important to the franchise: Paul Arizin, Julius Erving, Charles Barkley, who has about the same amount of win shares as Irving does, but in 200 fewer games. Neil Johnston, who was a great player in the 50s, along with Arizin, Maurice Cheeks, and of course, Allen Iverson. But I don't think I did put this one as an argument because there's just so many other candidates who are really interesting. But I think it's Chamberlain without a doubt.
Yeah, I could maybe make an argument for Julius Erving, but I would definitely go with Will Chamberlain, I think, on this one. Irving's the only one I would listen to. Maybe an Iverson to an extent, but I think
Barkley I would listen to if the fact that he didn't have his best team success elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly, right. I agree.
So Phoenix is kind of a weird one. They've been around since the Suns have been around since '69. Their actual leader in win shares is Sean Marion with 93 in 660 games. Kevin Johnson is 90.9 in 683, so fairly close. Nash has 82.7 in actually 744 games, so he's behind those two. Westfall and Barkley, who are guys who you might think of as well, are 10th and 11th on that list. So. I'm tempted to say Nash because of the MVPs and because, he's obviously the first guy you think of when it comes to those Phoenix teams. He spent most of his career in Phoenix, although obviously played in Dallas too. Marion's he's played a lot of other places, won a championship in Dallas. was kind of, considered a malcontent, so there's an issue. Kevin Johnson's he's kind of an interesting pick, but I don't know if being Sacramento mayor matters at all, and being so important in Sacramento keeping their team, if that's has any factor.
I use that as a knock against him in a little bit of ways in our mythical random, like, whatever the hell we're basing this on, but
sure.
so. This one's tough. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna not pick one.
I mean,
and hopefully
guess,
move on. Like, I can't do it. I don't know.
I guess I'll pick Nash. I just feel like he's the guy who's still synonymous, but I think Marion deserves some re-examination here because, man, he was really great.
Yeah, and he played there for a while too. I mean, people sort of just assumed that Nash came in and Marion just sort of appeared, but no, he was there.
Marion was there. 2000. I think Nash joined in 2004. So, and Amari too. I mean, he's a little bit down the list, but he had he's another guy who. I mean, the Suns for a team that's never won a championship, they've had a lot of really good players and a lot of deep playoff runs. So. Next is Sacramento. Since '86, the Kings have had in Sacramento, and this is a pretty surprise. It was a bit of a surprise to me because the first guys I would think of would be Mitch Richmond or Chris Webber, probably Chris Webber, honestly, because of the team success.
Same thing.
But Peja had 559.8 win shares in 518 games. Weber had and more than Richmond in a similar number of games, only one fewer game for Richmond. He had 50.4. Weber had 45.5 in 377, so a better win share per 48. And I think with the team success, I mean, he felt more important to the team success at the time. But Peja, I mean, you look at those, like, he's a guy who'd be more appreciated now, I think, than he was at the time because of what, we kind of value that spacing and we value his shooting and, the defensive, he had issues with defense. Of course, Weber wasn't the best defender either. So I don't know. I mean, that's a tough one.
Yeah, I initially go Weber with this one just because of the fame he sort of brought to Sacramento during it, because I see him as being the more pivotal, obviously the more pivotal part of the success of those teams. But you can definitely make an argument for Peja and even a Mitch Richmond as well. But to me, I go Chris Webber.
I think
without a doubt.
I think one thing we conclude is that Peja is more important to those teams than we need to remember that he was pretty important to those teams, maybe more than people think about. So
he's a guy that I wonder now if I had watched those Sacramento teams that, like, everybody would be talking about Chris Webber and, like, I'd be the Peja's underrated guy, because you really look at his numbers and, like, dude was really, really good on those teams, and especially now looking back, it's pretty. I thought it was a little bit later until he got good, but man, he was a really awesome player for those teams. So yeah.
And Toronto has a similar problem to Orlando in that they've the Raptors since '96. They also had a year as the Huskies in '47. They do not factor so much into this. That their two best players, Chris Bosh and Vince Carter, who basically have similar win share per 48 numbers. Bosh has more, 61.8 to 47.7 total. Both of them left in acrimonious circumstances. Probably Carter in more acrimonious circumstances, though that's debatable. The third is Jose Calderon, who's a good soldier, but not really, an elite player. And then your Morris Petersons, who was there for a long time, and I know he's kind of a guy who's beloved in the city.
Yeah, JYD Junkyard Dog is a guy that's beloved there.
Yeah, but it's none of those guys are really all that good.
I would probably do Vince Carter, especially now that they've sort of re-embraced him. I think it was last year where they brought him back, and it sort of was a calming thing for. I wrote about it. I did a big piece at Hickory High about Vince Carter sort of coming back and that sort of everything that came with that. And I thought that was a good moment for him and for the franchise to really, now that they have, and they embrace it too. They started embracing Vince Carter as a part of their history after a while of just kind of, as we said, like being more like Orlando for a lot of ways. So I think to me now he's definitely taken that mantle, and I think he's going to have it for a while.
Yeah, he's also more of a transcendent player. I mean, Bosh was a very good player. He still is. But he's going to be more known as a Heat than as a Raptor, I would say.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And just the dunk contest and the dunks and the highlights or whatever. I mean, Vince Carter will live on forever. Yeah.
So our last city, Washington, D.C., which is home of the Capitals from 47 to 51 in the early NBA. Another Capitals team in the ABA in 1970, and then they have been the Bullets Wizards franchise franchise since '74, moving from Baltimore. So, kind of an interesting one again. Actually, if you look at win shares, Hayes and Unseld played the exact same number of seasons. Hayes played more games. He's quite a bit ahead in win share, 72.4 to 59.3. But I think Unseld's the guy who's remembered. He's also the guy who was coach and GM of that franchise later, although those were really bad teams for the most part. So I'm not sure exactly how much that's benefited. But I think Unseld's a guy who's beloved, and Hayes is a guy who's not really ever been embraced because he's just has a surly reputation. So. The other guy who's an interesting one is Arenas, who, of course, was really embraced by the city until he started the finger guns, bringing arms into the locker room, and the eccentric behavior started to catch up with him, and then he just got hurt and became a bad player. But for a while, he was very, very good, and definitely the guy who was that franchise player, that they hadn't had for a long time for a few years in the 2000s.
Yeah, and you have John Wall, who's 23rd right now, win shares wise. He definitely has an opportunity to sort of lead that next generation of Wizards. He's a
guy. He doesn't even necessarily need. I mean, Hayes and Unseld have a championship, but he doesn't even necessarily need to have a whole.
No, he needs to have
success.
10 really good years.
Right.
Yeah. And if he becomes a star, like a legitimate bona fide star, he's there definitely.
And Unseld's lower on this because it doesn't count his Baltimore years from 68 to 74. So if it did, then he would be higher. But because of the
and I would probably go Unseld regardless. He's just, to me, when I think of the Bullets or Washington, I think Unseld. But I thought it was kind of interesting. Brendan Haywood is 6th on their win shares all time, which is just played there a lot. But man, Brendan,
that's not been a good franchise.
That's not a good franchise. You can't have Brendan Haywood be in your top 10 of win shares all time, especially since they've been around forever. I mean, they have historic teams, they have title teams, they have all this sort of stuff, and it's like Brendan Haywood.
So that's what
I'd go Unseld on this one.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think there's some, and I think Wall is interesting because I think for Toronto, I mean, I don't think it's super likely, but I think DeMar DeRozan's kind of an interesting guy who could kind of be in that conversation. He's never going to be he's never going to have the peaks of Carter, but if he's like consistent for long enough and they're like a good team, like I could see him kind of being a guy who, most fans be the first guy they think of when they think of the franchise.
Certainly. Yeah, definitely.
All right, Rich. Well, I think
that was fun.
A fun experiment. So hopefully people will are interested in this show, and
we need arguments. People need to comment on the show post with all your arguments of how we're idiots. Tell us how big of idiots we are.
This is definitely one where we would love the feedback on the comments. Twitter will be fine as well, at Over and Back NBA. And of course, as we mentioned before, if you want to leave some comments about the podcast, not necessarily about reacting to this, just comments about how good or bad we are on iTunes, rating and review, that would be wonderful as well. On the HB Basketball Network, you can find the link at the bottom of the post. So, Rich, it's been swell.
It has been. Thank you.
All right. Well, until next time, goodbye, everyone.